My daughter Amelia stood in my kitchen doorway, her face streaked with tears, holding a crumpled piece of paper in her trembling hands. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I found this letter in Dad's old desk, the one where you told him you couldn't love me, that you wanted him to give me away." She thought she had discovered the proof of my rejection, the explanation for years of distance between us. What she didn't know was that the letter she found was only half the story, and the box hidden in my bedroom closet contained the truth that would heal both our broken hearts forever. Hold up, I'm curious where you're listening from, and if this story spoke to you, make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, what I have planned for tomorrow is going to blow you away. The afternoon light filtered through my kitchen windows in Riverside Falls, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table where Amelia now sat, the letter spread before her like evidence in a trial. I stood frozen by the counter, my coffee mug halfway to my lips, watching 23 years of careful distance between us finally explode into the open. My daughter, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, looked at me with eyes that held a lifetime of questions I'd never been brave enough to answer. She was the spitting image of her father Robert at that age, with his dark auburn hair and those deep green eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. But where Robert had always been gentle and understanding, Amelia's gaze now burned with hurt and accusation. "Is this why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is this why you've always been so cold to me? Why you never came to my school plays or graduation? Why you'd leave the room whenever I tried to hug you?" She held up the letter, and I could see my own handwriting from over 2 decades ago, faded but still legible. "Because you never wanted me in the first place?" I set down my mug with shaking hands. The letter. After all these years, she'd found the letter. The one I'd written to Robert 3 weeks after bringing her home from the hospital, when I was drowning in a darkness so deep I couldn't see any way out. The letter where I'd begged him to consider adoption because I was terrified I would destroy this innocent child with my inability to bond, my complete emotional shutdown, my fear that I was broken in some fundamental way that would poison everything I touched. But she hadn't found the other letters. She hadn't found Robert's patient responses or the journal entries where I documented my struggle with what I now know was severe postpartum depression. She hadn't found the box where I'd kept every photo I'd secretly taken of her, every report card I'd treasured, every drawing she'd made that I'd carefully preserved while maintaining the distance I thought would protect her from my damaged heart. "Amelia," I began, but she cut me off. "Don't," she said, standing up so fast her chair scraped against the tile floor. "Don't try to explain it away. I finally understand why you've spent my entire life treating me like a stranger, why Dad always made excuses for you, why he was the one who came to everything, who tucked me in, who dried my tears. Because you didn't want me. You wanted to give me away like some unwanted pet." The pain in her voice was like a physical blow. This was my worst nightmare come to life. My daughter believing that my love for her was conditional, that my struggle to express affection meant I felt none. For 23 years, I'd maintained careful emotional distance, not because I didn't love her, but because I'd loved her so much it terrified me. Because I'd been convinced that someone as broken as I was would inevitably hurt someone as perfect as she was. I thought back to those early weeks after her birth, when the depression had hit me like a freight train. I'd gone from being a successful marketing director in Portland to being unable to get out of bed, unable to look at my beautiful baby without feeling like an imposter, a fraud who would somehow contaminate her innocence with my inexplicable sadness. Robert had tried everything, doctors, medication, therapy, but nothing seemed to reach me in that dark place. That letter she'd found was written during my darkest moment, when I genuinely believed that she would be better off with parents who could love her the way she deserved. Parents who wouldn't flinch when she reached for them, who wouldn't feel like they were drowning every time she cried, who wouldn't be terrified that their brokenness would somehow transfer to her pure spirit. What I'd never told her was that Robert had refused, not angrily, but with a gentle firmness that probably saved all our lives. He'd held me while I sobbed and told me that we would figure it out together, that love wasn't always easy or immediate, that some people, especially people who grew up in homes like mine where affection was weaponized and love was conditional, had to learn how to accept and give love safely. But I'd never told Amelia any of this. As the years passed and I slowly healed, learning to manage my mental health and find ways to show love that felt safe to me, I'd maintain the distance out of habit, out of fear, out of a misguided belief that it was better for her to have one parent who loved her completely than to risk disappointing her with my still imperfect emotional availability. I'd loved her fiercely from afar. I'd paid for her college tuition without telling her it was me, claiming it was a scholarship. I'd called her professors when she was struggling with anxiety, arranging for extra support while making it look like standard academic assistance. I'd driven to her apartment building during her worst breakup and sat in my car all night, just to be close in case she needed me, though I never knocked on her door. But she didn't know any of that. All she knew was a mother who seemed to tolerate her presence, who showed love through actions she couldn't see rather than words and hugs she desperately needed. Now she stood in my kitchen, holding the evidence of my lowest moment, believing it represented the truth of my heart. The irony was devastating. She'd found proof of my struggle to love her, when what I'd actually struggled with was my fear that my love wasn't good enough, wasn't pure enough, wasn't safe enough for someone as precious as she was. "I'm moving to Denver," she said, folding the letter carefully and slipping it into her purse. "I got the job at the graphic design firm. I wanted to tell you in person, but now I understand why you probably won't care. You've been waiting for me to leave for 23 years. She moved toward the door, and I felt something inside me break open. Not the careful, controlled crack I'd been managing for decades, but a complete shattering of the walls I'd built to protect both of us. She was leaving. She was moving across the country believing that her own mother had never wanted her, and I was about to lose my last chance to tell her the truth. "Amelia, wait," I called out, my voice stronger than it had been in years. "There's something you need to see. Something that will change everything you think you know about that letter, about me, about us." She paused at the door, her hand on the knob, not turning around. "What could possibly change the fact that you wanted to give me away?" I took a deep breath, knowing that what I was about to do would either heal us both or destroy what little relationship we had left. Because that letter wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the greatest love I've ever known, and the greatest sacrifice I've ever made. And if you give me 5 minutes, I can prove it to you. The silence stretched between us like a chasm 23 years in the making. Everything hung in the balance. Her willingness to listen, my courage to finally tell the truth, and the fragile hope that love, even imperfect love, even love that looked like distance, might be enough to bridge the gap between a mother's broken heart and a daughter's wounded soul. We poured our hearts into researching and telling the story. If you're hooked, show some love with the subscribe. Now, where were we? I watched my daughter's hand hover over the doorknob, and I knew this was my only chance. 23 years of careful silence was about to either save us or destroy us completely. "Amelia, please, just 5 minutes. Let me show you what you didn't find." She turned around slowly, her face a mask of skepticism and pain. "What could possibly change the fact that you wanted to give me up for adoption?" I walked past her to my bedroom, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, I heard her reluctant footsteps following. This was the moment I dreaded and hoped for since she was born. The moment that I'd have to reveal the truth about the darkest period of my life and the most profound love I'd ever experienced. My bedroom closet still smelled like the lavender sachets I'd placed there years ago. I pushed aside my winter coats and reached for the wooden box hidden behind them. It was cedar, about the size of a small suitcase, and it felt heavy with the weight of secrets I'd carried alone for over 2 decades. Amelia stood in my doorway, arms crossed, watching me with wary eyes as I placed the box on my bed. The afternoon light streaming through my bedroom window made the wood grain glow, and for a moment I was transported back to the day Robert had given me this box, 3 months after Amelia was born. "Before you look inside," I said, my voice trembling, "I need to tell you about the worst 3 months of my life. The months that letter came from." I sat on the edge of my bed, the box between us, like a bridge I was finally ready to cross. "When you were born, something went wrong with me. Not with you, you were perfect, absolutely perfect. But something in my brain broke. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't stop crying. Every time I looked at you, instead of feeling joy, I felt terror." Amelia's expression softened slightly, confusion replacing some of the anger. "Postpartum depression?" "Severe postpartum depression with psychotic features," I said, using the clinical terms I'd learned years later. But back then, in 1999, in small-town Riverside Falls, nobody talked about it. When I told my mother I was struggling, she said I was being dramatic. When I told my doctor, he said it was normal baby blues and would pass. I opened the box with shaking hands. Inside, neatly organized in separate compartments, were hundreds of photographs. Photos I'd taken secretly, from doorways and windows, of Amelia growing up. Her first steps, captured from behind the kitchen door, her playing in the backyard, photographed through my bedroom window, her graduation day, taken from the back of the auditorium where she couldn't see me. "I was there," I whispered, lifting out a photo of her at age 5, building a snowman with Robert. I'd taken it from our living room window. I was always there, but I was terrified that if I got too close, if I touched you too much, I would somehow contaminate you with my darkness. Amelia picked up another photo, herself at 10, performing in the school play. I remembered that night clearly. I'd sat in my car in the parking lot for 2 hours, wanting desperately to go inside, but convinced that my presence would somehow jinx her performance. "The letter you found," I continued, "was written during my worst week. I hadn't slept in 4 days. I was hallucinating, seeing shadows that weren't there, hearing voices telling me I was going to hurt you. I wrote that letter to your father because I genuinely believed I was dangerous, that you would be safer with parents who weren't broken like me." I pulled out a manila folder from the bottom of the box. Inside were more letters, Robert's responses to mine, filled with patience and love and determination to keep our family together. There were doctor's reports from the psychiatrist he'd finally convinced me to see. There were therapy notes documenting my slow recovery. And there were journal entries I'd written to Amelia throughout her childhood, letters I'd never sent, but had poured my heart into. "Your father saved us all," I said, tears starting to flow freely. "He refused to even consider adoption. He said that love isn't always immediate, that some people have to learn how to love safely. He got me help, real help. He took family leave and cared for both of us while I learned how to manage my illness." Amelia was now sitting beside me on the bed, holding a photo of herself at 16, getting her driver's license. I'd been there too, hidden behind a pillar at the DMD, my heart bursting with pride and fear in equal measure. "But why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice small and hurt. "Why did you keep pushing me away, even after you got better?" I pulled out the last item from the box, a thick notebook bound in purple leather, her favorite color, "because by the time I was well enough to love you properly, you were 3 years old. You'd already learned to go to Daddy for everything. You'd already adapted to having one fully present parent and one distant one. I was terrified that if I suddenly tried to change the dynamic, I would confuse you, hurt you, make you feel like my earlier distance had been your fault somehow. I opened the notebook to a random page and began to read. Amelia's first day of kindergarten. I watched from across the street as Robert walked her to the school door. She was so brave, my little girl, carrying her purple backpack and holding his hand. I wanted to run to her, to hug her, to tell her how proud I was. Instead, I went home and cried for 2 hours, then spent the rest of the day researching the best ways to help children succeed in school. I bought all the recommended books and left them on Robert's desk with a note about how they might help her. Amelia's eyes widened. You bought all those educational books? Dad always said they were his idea. I bought them. I researched which schools had the best programs when you were ready for middle school. I'm the one who suggested he sign you up for art classes when I noticed you were doodling on everything. I'm the one who made sure there was always money in your college fund, even when we were struggling financially. I flipped through more pages, showing her years of detailed observations, proud moments documented in secret, worries and hopes for her future, written in my careful handwriting. Every parent-teacher conference, I would call your teachers the next day, pretending to be following up on Robert's visit, just to make sure I hadn't missed anything important. Every school play, every recital, every game, I was there, just hidden. I learned to love you from a distance because I was terrified that loving you up close would somehow damage you the way my own mother's conditional love had damaged me. Amelia was now crying, holding a photo of herself at 18, prom night. You were at my prom? In the hotel lobby, pretending to read a newspaper while you and your date took pictures by the fountain. You looked so beautiful, so grown up. I wanted to tell you, but you seemed so happy, so confident. I thought maybe my way of loving you had worked. You'd grown up secure in your father's affection without being burdened by my complicated feelings. I closed the notebook and looked at my daughter, really looked at her for the first time in years, without the barrier of fear between us. The truth is, Amelia, I've loved you every day of your life, but I loved you the only way I knew how, carefully, quietly, from a safe distance where my brokenness couldn't touch your light.
The room fell silent, except for our quiet crying. Outside, I could hear the familiar sounds of Riverside Falls in the late afternoon. Children playing in the distance, cars driving down our quiet street, the normal sounds of a life I'd observed but never fully participated in. Amelia reached into the box and pulled out one more item I hadn't shown her, a small velvet jewelry box. Inside was a simple silver locket, engraved with her initials and birth date. I bought this the day you were born, I whispered. I've been waiting 23 years for the right moment to give it to you. The right moment when I was brave enough to tell you the truth about everything. She held the locket up to the light, and I could see her entire understanding of our relationship shifting, rewriting itself in real time. The distance she'd interpreted as rejection was actually protection. The absence she'd felt was actually presence, just hidden. The mother she'd thought didn't love her had actually loved her so much that she'd sacrificed her own need for closeness to keep her safe. "Mom?" she said, and it was the first time in years she'd said that word without anger or resignation in her voice. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought you just didn't like me." I reached out and touched her face for the first time since she was small, my hand trembling against her cheek. "Baby girl, I've liked you every day of your life. I've loved you every second. I just didn't know how to show you without risking everything we'd both worked so hard to build." That's when she did something that broke my heart and healed it simultaneously. She leaned into my touch, closing her eyes like she was a child again, and whispered, "I've been waiting my whole life for you to touch my face like that." And in that moment, I realized that my greatest fear, that my love wasn't enough, wasn't good enough, wasn't safe enough, had been wrong all along. Sometimes the greatest love requires the greatest sacrifice. But sometimes Just sometimes. The time comes when sacrifice can finally transform into presence, and distance can finally collapse into the embrace you've both been waiting for your entire lives. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, surrounded by the evidence of a love story that had been hidden in plain sight for over 2 decades. Amelia held the silver locket in her palm, turning it over and over, as if trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly been turned upside down. "I need some air," she finally said, standing abruptly and walking to my bedroom window. She pushed it open, letting the cool evening breeze drift in, along with the distant sounds of Riverside Falls settling into dusk. "This is a lot to process, Mom." I watched her silhouette against the fading light, noting how she held her shoulders, a habit she'd inherited from me, though I'd never been close enough to tell her that. "I know it is, sweetheart. Take all the time you need." She turned back to face me, and I could see the war happening behind her eyes. 23 years of feeling unloved doesn't disappear in a single afternoon, no matter how compelling the evidence. "But I still don't understand why you couldn't have just told me some of this. Why did it have to be so extreme? Why couldn't we have found a middle ground?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself countless times over the years. "Because I was terrified of failing you twice," I admitted. "The first 3 months of your life, I failed you because I was sick. After that, I was so afraid of failing you again that I chose what felt like the safest option, loving you from a distance where I couldn't mess up." Amelia sat back down on the bed, but this time she left space between us. The physical distance felt symbolic, a representation of the emotional gap we were trying to bridge. "Do you realize how many times I tried to reach out to you growing up? How many times I would stand outside your bedroom door wanting to talk to you about boys or school or just life, but you always seemed so untouchable?" The pain in her voice cut through me like a knife. I remember every single time. I would lie in bed after you walked away, hating myself for not opening the door, but convinced that if I did, I would say the wrong thing or react the wrong way and push you even further away. "So instead you chose to keep me away entirely?" There was no accusation in her voice anymore, just a deep sadness that somehow hurt worse than her earlier anger. I nodded, tears starting fresh. "I chose what I thought was safety over what I knew you needed. I chose my comfort over your emotional security. I was a coward who disguised her fear as protection." She picked up one of the photos from the box, her high school graduation. "Were you really there, hidden in the back?" "Third row from the back, behind the Hendersons," I said without hesitation. "You wore that blue dress we'd bought together, the only shopping trip we ever took, remember? You were so surprised when I offered to take you."
"I thought you were just being polite because Dad was working that day," she said quietly. "I volunteered to take you because I wanted to be part of choosing what you'd wear for one of the biggest days of your life. But then in the store, when you asked my opinion about the dresses, I was so afraid of steering you wrong that I kept saying, 'Whatever you think is best,' until you got frustrated and just picked one yourself." Amelia let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I remember being so disappointed. I wanted my mom's opinion so badly, and you seemed like you couldn't wait to get out of there. I was fighting a panic attack the entire time, I confessed. Not because I didn't want to be there, but because I wanted to be there so much, and I was terrified I would ruin it somehow. I went home and cried for hours afterward, convinced I'd blown my one chance to have a normal mother-daughter moment with you. The irony of our mutual misunderstanding was almost too painful to bear. While I'd been desperately trying not to damage her, she'd been desperately trying to connect with me. We'd both been reaching for each other across a chasm of fear and miscommunication, our fingertips never quite touching. "There's something else," Amelia said, and her tone had shifted slightly. "Something I need to tell you now that we're being honest about everything." I braced myself, recognizing the particular set of her jaw that meant she was about to say something difficult. I'm not just moving to Denver for the job. I'm moving because I met someone. His name is Trevor, and he lives there. We've been dating long distance for 8 months. My heart clenched, not because she was moving for love, but because she felt she couldn't tell me about someone important in her life. Tell me about him, I said, working to keep my voice steady and encouraging. He's a teacher, elementary school. He's kind and patient and, she paused, looking at me carefully, and he thinks it's weird that I never talk about my mom. He comes from this big, close-knit family where everyone called each other constantly and gets together for Sunday dinners, and he can't understand why I'm not close to you. I felt the familiar stab of failure, the knowledge that my attempts to protect her had actually damaged her ability to form relationships. What do you tell him? I told him that we're just different people, that some families aren't as close as others. But the truth is, it's been embarrassing. Here's this wonderful man who wants to meet my family, who talks about his parents and siblings constantly, and I have to explain why my own mother feels like a stranger to me. The weight of all the damage I'd done, all the normal relationship patterns I'd disrupted, settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. Amelia, I'm so sorry. I never thought about how my distance would affect your other relationships. That's not why I'm telling you this, she said quickly. I'm telling you because Trevor said something to me last week that made me realize I needed to confront the situation with you, one way or another. She took a deep breath, gathering courage for whatever she was about to say. He said that sometimes the people we love hurt us not because they don't care, but because they care too much and don't know how to handle the intensity of their feelings. He said that maybe I was so focused on feeling rejected by you that I never considered that your distance might be coming from a place of love rather than indifference. I stared at my daughter, this wise young woman who'd somehow grown up to be more emotionally intelligent than I'd ever been, despite my failures as her mother. He sounds like a smart man. He is. And he's the one who suggested I look through Dad's old papers before I moved. He said that sometimes the answers we need are hiding in places we haven't thought to look. She gestured to the box between us. He was right, wasn't he? The realization hit me like a lightning bolt. Trevor encouraged you to look for that letter? Not specifically the letter, but he encouraged me to try to understand you better before I moved across the country. He said that carrying unresolved family pain into a new relationship isn't fair to anyone involved. I felt a surge of gratitude toward this man I'd never met, who'd loved my daughter enough to push her toward healing, rather than simply accepting her brokenness as unchangeable. I'd like to meet him someday, if you'll let me. Amelia's eyes filled with fresh tears. I'd like that too. But Mom, I need you to understand something. This conversation, this box, these revelations, they don't erase 23 years of feeling unwanted. They explain them and they help me understand you better, but they don't fix everything instantly. My heart sank, even though I knew she was right. I know. I don't expect them to. I'm still moving to Denver. I'm still going to marry Trevor. He proposed last month, but I didn't know how to tell you because I wasn't sure you'd care. The news should have filled me with joy, but instead it felt like another door closing, another opportunity missed. Congratulations, I managed, meaning it despite my sadness. I'm happy for you. But, she said, and the word hung between us like a bridge, I want to try. I want to figure out how to have a relationship with you, even if it looks different than what most mothers and daughters have. I want to learn how to trust that your love is real, even when it doesn't look like what I expected love to look like. The hope that bloomed in my chest was so intense, it was almost painful. Are you sure? I understand if you need space to process all of this. I'm sure, but I need you to promise me something. Her voice became firm, taking on an authority that reminded me of her father. I need you to promise me that you'll work on this with me, that you'll go to therapy, that you'll learn better ways to show love, that you won't use your mental health as an excuse to keep hiding from me. The request was fair, necessary, and terrifying. It meant no more hiding behind my fear, no more choosing comfort over connection. It meant learning to be vulnerable in ways I'd spent decades avoiding. I promise, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. Amelia reached across the space between us and took my hand, the first time she'd initiated physical contact with me in years. Her touch was tentative, careful, but it was real. "We're going to figure this out," she said, squeezing my fingers gently. "It's going to be messy and complicated and probably really hard sometimes, but we're going to figure it out." As I sat there holding my daughter's hand in the growing darkness, surrounded by the evidence of all the love I'd hidden and all the pain I'd caused, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. Hope. Not the desperate, fearful hope I had carried all these years that maybe, someday we'd find our way to each other, but a solid, grounded hope based on 2 people who'd finally decided to stop running from each other and start running towards something better. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks and misunderstandings, and moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But for the first time since the day she was born, I believed that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for us to build something real together. Outside my window, Riverside Falls was settling into night, the familiar sounds of home drifting through the open window. And inside, a mother and daughter were finally ready to stop being strangers to each other and start learning how to be family. 3 weeks later, I found myself sitting in Dr. Patricia Caldwell's office on Maple Street, my hands folded in my lap like a schoolchild waiting to be scolded. The therapy office was nothing like I had expected. No intimidating leather couch or clinical white walls. Instead, it felt like someone's comfortable living room with soft lighting and plants everywhere, the kind of space that invited honesty rather than demanding it. "So, Catherine," Dr. Caldwell said, consulting her notes, "Amelia called me last week to schedule this appointment. She said you've both committed to working on your relationship and that you're ready to address some long-standing patterns. Tell me about that decision." I shifted in my chair, still unused to having my mental health be a topic of open discussion rather than a shameful secret. 23 years ago, I made choices based on fear rather than love. I thought I was protecting my daughter, but I was really protecting myself. Now she's getting married and moving to Denver, and if I don't change now, I'll lose her forever. Dr. Caldwell nodded, making a note. "And how does Amelia feel about you being here?" "She's skeptical," I admitted. "She wants to believe things can change, but she's been disappointed by me so many times that she's protecting herself. She said she'll know I'm serious about this when I start doing the work, not just talking about it." That's when my phone buzzed. A text from Amelia. "Mom, can you come to my apartment after your appointment? There's someone I want you to meet, if you're ready." My heart stopped. Trevor. She wanted me to meet her fiancé, the man she's moving across the country to marry, who I know nothing about except that he's the reason she finally confronted me about our relationship. Dr. Caldwell noticed my expression. "Good news or bad news?" "I'm not sure yet," I said, showing her the message. "My daughter wants me to meet her fiancé today, the man she's moving across the country to marry, who I know nothing about except that he's the reason she finally confronted me about our relationship. How does that make you feel?"
Or, Dr. Caldwell said gently, because meeting him is part of the relationship you and Amelia are choosing to build going forward. Not a reward for past behavior, but an investment in future behavior. An hour later, I stood outside Amelia's apartment building on Cedar Lane, the same building where I'd sat in my car during her worst breakup, wanting to help but not knowing how. The irony wasn't lost on me. Now I was actually walking through the front door instead of hiding in the parking lot. Amelia opened her apartment door before I could knock, as if she'd been watching for me. She looked nervous, which somehow made me feel better. At least I wasn't the only one who understood the magnitude of this moment. "Mom," she said, stepping aside to let me in, "this is Trevor." The man who stood up from her couch was not what I'd expected. He was shorter than I'd imagined, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He was wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, nothing fancy,
but he moved toward me with the confidence of someone who was genuinely happy to be there. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, extending his hand, "I've been looking forward to meeting you for months. Amelia talks about you all the time." I shook his hand, startled by his warmth and the lie he'd just told. "She talks about me?" "All the time," he repeated, his smile never wavering. "She told me about your photography, how you documented her whole childhood from a distance. She showed me some of the pictures from your box. That photo of her at the science fair when she was 12, the one you took from behind the gymnasium bleachers, it's beautiful. You captured this moment of pure concentration on her face." I glanced at Amelia, confused. When had she started talking about me positively? When had my secret documentation become something she shared with pride rather than shame? "I also understand you're the reason she's so good with money. She told me how you secretly managed her college fund, how you made sure she graduated debt-free even though she thought it was scholarship money." "Trevor," Amelia said softly, a warning in her voice. "What?" he said, looking genuinely confused. "It's true. You told me that your mom sacrificed her own retirement savings to make sure you could go to college without loans. That's incredible." I felt the room tilt slightly. "You told him that?" Amelia sat down across from me, her cheeks flushed. "After our conversation 3 weeks ago, I started seeing a lot of things differently. I started realizing that what I thought was neglect was actually you taking care of me in ways I didn't recognize." Trevor reached over and took Amelia's hand. "Tell her about the soccer coach." "Coach Williams, from high school," Amelia said, and I could see tears starting in her eyes. "I called him too. He remembered you. He said you were the parent who always made sure the team had proper equipment, who quietly paid for uniforms for kids whose families couldn't afford it. He said you never wanted credit for it, but you were the reason half the team could participate." I sat in stunned silence, realizing that my attempts at invisible support hadn't been as invisible as I thought they were. While I'd been convinced I was failing as a mother, other adults in Amelia's life had seen a different story. A parent who cared deeply, but expressed that care through action rather than presence. "Why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" I asked. "Because I didn't know," Amelia said simply. "You were so good at hiding your involvement that I never connected the dots. I thought all those things just happened by coincidence, or that Dad was responsible for all of it."
Trevor looked between us, and I could see him processing the complexity of our relationship in real time. "Amelia told me about your conversation 3 weeks ago, about the postpartum depression and your fear of damaging her. I have to say, Mrs. Patterson, as someone who works with children every day, what you did was remarkable." "What do you mean?" "You found a way to be present in her life without letting your own struggles affect her sense of security. You made sure she had one parent who was completely emotionally available while you worked on getting healthy. That's not selfish. That's incredibly selfless." I looked at this man who barely knew me, but who seemed to understand the situation better than I'd understood it myself. "I'm not sure I see it that way." "Because you're viewing it from the perspective of what you couldn't give her," he said gently. "But from the outside, looking at the evidence, it looks like you found a way to give her everything she needed, even when you couldn't give it directly. You made sure she was loved, supported, protected, and provided for. You just did it in a way that kept your illness from affecting her development." Amelia leaned forward. "Mom, I need to tell you something else. Something I realized after talking to all those people from my childhood." I braced myself, not sure I could handle any more revelations. "I wasn't as oblivious as you thought. Part of me always knew you were there, watching out for me. I could feel it, even when I couldn't see it. When I was little, I used to tell Dad that I thought you were like a guardian angel, that you were protecting me from far away because you were too important to risk getting too close." The room went completely silent. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of life continuing. Cars passing, people talking, the world moving forward while mine stood completely still. "You knew?" I whispered. Part of me knew, the little girl part that hadn't learned to interpret distance as rejection. She knew that even when you weren't in the room, you were somehow taking care of things.
It wasn't until I got older and started comparing our family to other families that I decided your distance meant you didn't love me. Trevor cleared his throat gently. Amelia, why don't you show her the other thing? Amelia got up and went to her bedroom, returning with a small wooden box of her own. I started keeping this after our conversation, she said, placing it on the coffee table between us. Evidence of all the ways you loved me that I missed at the time. She opened the box to reveal a collection of items I didn't recognize at first. A letter from my insurance company thanking me for enrolling her in the premium dental plan, a receipt from the bookstore showing I'd bought every book in a series she'd mentioned loving, a scholarship notification that I now realized hadn't been a scholarship at all. This box is proof that I've been loved every day of my life, she said, her voice steady and sure. I just didn't know how to recognize it because it didn't look like the love I saw in other families. But it was love. It was profound, sacrificial, careful love. And I'm sorry it took me 23 years to see it. I looked at my daughter, this wise young woman who'd grown up to understand love in all its complicated forms, and I realized that despite all my fears, despite all my careful distance, despite all the ways I thought I'd failed her, somehow she'd learned to love well. She'd chosen a partner who saw the good in complicated family dynamics. She'd learned to look deeper than surface appearances. She developed the emotional intelligence to re-examine her assumptions when presented with new information. Maybe I hadn't failed her after all. Maybe love, even imperfect love, even love that looks like distance, had been enough to help her become the remarkable woman sitting across from me. I have something for you, too, I said, reaching into my purse for the small wrapped box I'd been carrying for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. I bought this the day you told me about Trevor, but I wasn't sure you'd want it. Amelia unwrapped the box to reveal a simple gold bracelet with 2 charms, a heart engraved with her birth date, and a small house engraved with an address. That's the address of my first apartment after college, she said, looking confused. The address where you met Trevor online, I said. I had the charm made because that's where your real life started, where you found the person who would help you understand that love comes in many different forms, and that sometimes the people who care about us most are the people who love us enough to help us grow. Trevor looked at the bracelet, then at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. You've been watching out for her even now, haven't you? Even as an adult. I never stopped, I admitted. I never could. Being her mother from a distance was better than not being her mother at all. And in that moment, sitting in my daughter's living room with the man she loved, surrounded by evidence of a love story that had been hidden in plain sight for over 20 decades, I finally understood what Trevor had seen from the beginning, that love isn't always loud or obvious or easy to recognize, but it's always there, working quietly in the background, making sure the people we care about have what they need to thrive.
6 months later, I stood in the Denver International Airport, my hands shaking as I gripped the handle of my small suitcase. The wedding invitation in my purse had been hand-delivered by Amelia herself during her last visit to Riverside Falls, written in elegant script that read, "Catherine Patterson, beloved mother of the bride, your presence is requested." Beloved mother of the bride. After 23 years of feeling like a stranger in my own daughter's life, those words had made me cry for an hour. The flight from Atlanta had been smooth, but my nerves were anything but calm. This would be the longest amount of time Amelia and I had spent together since she was a child. 3 days in Denver for wedding festivities, staying in the same hotel, attending rehearsal dinners and family gatherings where I would be introduced as her mother to people who actually mattered in her life. Dr. Caldwell's voice echoed in my head from our session 2 days ago. "Catherine, you've spent 6 months learning to trust that Amelia's love is real. Now you need to trust that your own love is worthy of celebration." The baggage claim area was crowded with the usual chaos of arrivals and departures, but I spotted them immediately.
Amelia stood next to Trevor, bouncing slightly on her toes the way she used to do as a child when she was excited about something. She was wearing a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and her hair was longer than it had been 6 months ago, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. When she saw me, her face broke into a smile that was so genuine, so free of the careful politeness that had marked our interactions for years, that I almost stopped walking entirely. "Mom!" she called out, and the word carried across the crowded space like music. She ran toward me, actually ran, and wrapped me in a hug that was tight and real and lasted longer than any embrace we'd shared since she was small. I felt her breathe in deeply, as if she was memorizing the scent of my perfume, the same way I was memorizing the feeling of holding my grown daughter without fear or reservation for the first time in decades. "I'm so glad you're here," she whispered against my shoulder, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I whispered back, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. Trevor approached us with that same warm smile I'd come to appreciate over our weekly video calls, a routine Amelia had instituted to help us all get comfortable with the idea of being family. "Welcome to Denver, Mom," he said, and the casual use of that title from this man who barely knew me but had chosen to love my daughter made my throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," I said, and he looked genuinely puzzled. "Letting you? Catherine, you're Amelia's mother. Of course you're part of this." As we walked through the airport together, Amelia chattering about wedding details and pointing out Denver landmarks through the windows, I marveled at how natural it felt. 6 months ago, I would have been terrified of saying the wrong thing, of disappointing her, of somehow ruining her special weekend. Now, while I was still nervous, it was the normal nervousness of a mother who wanted her daughter's wedding to be perfect, not the paralyzing fear of someone who didn't know her place in the story. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken months of therapy sessions, of awkward phone calls that gradually became less awkward, of small visits that slowly built trust. There had been setbacks, moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, when I retreated into protective distance, or when Amelia fell back into defensive independence. But each time, we'd worked through it together instead of letting it drive us apart. The hotel room Amelia had reserved for me was directly across the hall from theirs, close enough that I could help with last-minute wedding preparations, but far enough away that we all had space when we needed it. It was a perfect metaphor for the relationship we were building. Intimate, but not suffocating. Connected, but not codependent. That evening, as I helped Amelia steam her wedding dress in her hotel room, she said something that stopped me in my tracks. "You know what's funny, Mom? Trevor's parents have been married for 32 years, and they're lovely people, but they don't really understand what we've been through. They keep asking Trevor if he's sure about marrying into a complicated family situation." I felt my old fears creeping back in. Maybe they're right to be concerned. Maybe I've created too much damage. "Stop," Amelia said firmly, turning away from the steamer to look at me directly. "Don't do that. Don't turn someone else's inability to understand our story into evidence that our story is wrong." She moved closer, taking my hands in hers. "Trevor told his parents that our family might be different from theirs, but it's not broken. He said that you're a mother who loved me so much that you were willing to sacrifice your own need for closeness to make sure I grew up feeling secure and supported. He said, that's not complicated. That's heroic."
The words hit me like a physical force. He said that? He did. And you know what his mother said when he told her about the box of photos, about all the ways you took care of me from a distance? Amelia smiled. She said she'd never heard of a love story like ours, and that she was honored to be welcoming us both into their family. That night, I attended the rehearsal dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Rocky Mountains. I sat at the family table between Amelia and Trevor's sister Sarah and listened to toasts that included me by name. Trevor's father stood up and spoke about the importance of family, of the different ways people show love, and of how grateful they were that Amelia had a mother who had taught her to recognize love even when it came in unexpected forms. "Amelia told us about your journey together," he said, looking directly at me. about how you've both learned that love isn't always loud or obvious, but it's always present, always working to protect and nurture the people we care about. That's the kind of love we want to celebrate today. Love that endures, love that grows, love that finds a way. When he raised his glass to toast the mothers who shaped the remarkable woman our son fell in love with, I felt something settle into place inside me that had been displaced for 23 years. I wasn't just being tolerated at the celebration. I was being honored as Amelia's mother, as someone whose love had contributed to making her the person she'd become. The next morning, I helped Amelia get ready for her wedding. She asked me to fasten the clasp on the silver locket I'd given her 23 years too late. "I've been wearing this every day since you gave it to me," she said, touching the small heart at her throat. "People always ask about it, and I tell them it's from my mother, who taught me that love is an action word." As I worked with the tiny clasp, my fingers less steady than they used to be, I said, "I wish I had taught you that sooner. I wish I had been braver about showing you how much I loved you." "But Mom," she said, catching my eyes in the mirror, "you did show me every day. I just wasn't looking in the right places." She turned around to face me, radiant in her wedding dress, more beautiful than I'd ever seen her. "You want to know the truth? I'm grateful for our story, exactly as it happened, because it taught me to look for love in quiet places, to value actions over words, to understand that people show care in different ways. That's part of why I fell in love with Trevor, because he loves quietly and steadily the way you do. He doesn't need to make grand gestures to prove his feelings. His love is in the everyday choices, in showing up consistently, in paying attention to what matters." He took my hands. "You taught me to recognize that kind of love. You taught me to value substance over performance. And now I'm marrying a man who loves me the same way you always have, deeply, carefully, and without conditions." An hour later, I walked my daughter down the aisle. It had been Trevor's suggestion, supported enthusiastically by Amelia and his family. "She raised you," he had said simply, when Amelia wondered if it was appropriate. "She should be the one to give you away." As we walked together through the garden where they'd chosen to exchange vows, Amelia whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mom, for loving me the only way you knew how, for never giving up on us, for being brave enough to change." When we reached the altar and Trevor stepped forward to take her hand, I kissed my daughter's cheek and whispered back, "Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real." The ceremony was beautiful, filled with personal touches that spoke to who Amelia and Trevor were as individuals and as a couple. When the officiant asked them to share their vows, Amelia spoke about finding a love that was both passionate and peaceful, a love that felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure at the same time. "Trevor," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the garden, "you taught me that love can be both safe and exciting, that I don't have to choose between security and growth. You love me enough to challenge me to be better while accepting me exactly as I am. That's the kind of love I want to give you for the rest of our lives." When it was Trevor's turn, he spoke about recognizing in Amelia someone who understood that love was both feeling and choice, someone who had learned to appreciate the quiet strength that comes from overcoming difficulties with grace. "Amelia, you've shown me that the most beautiful love stories aren't the ones without conflict, but the ones where people choose to work through conflict together. You've taught me that healing is possible, that relationships can be repaired, that it's never too late to build something better. I promise to love you with that same patience and persistence for all the days of my life." As they exchanged rings and kissed as husband and wife, I felt a completeness I hadn't known I was missing. This wasn't just my daughter getting married. This was the celebration of a love that had been tested and proven strong. The beginning of a new family that would carry forward the lessons we'd all learned about perseverance and grace. At the reception, Amelia asked me to dance with her during the mother-daughter dance. As we swayed together to a song she'd chosen specifically for us, "The Mother" by Brandi Carlile, about different ways of showing love, She rested her head on my shoulder the way she used to do when she was small. "I love you, Mom," she said, and the words were easy, natural, free of the careful reservation that had marked our relationship for so long. "I love you too, sweetheart," I replied, and for the first time in 23 years, I believed that she truly knew what those words meant coming from me. Later that night, as the celebration wound down and guests began to drift away, Trevor found me sitting at one of the garden tables, watching Amelia laugh with his cousins. "Thank you," he said, settling into the chair beside me. "For what?" "For raising the woman I fell in love with. For showing her what it means to love someone enough to put their needs first, even when it's difficult. For teaching her to be strong and independent and resilient." He paused, following my gaze to where Amelia was helping his elderly grandmother to her chair. "For loving her so well that she grew up to be someone who knows how to love well." As I watched my daughter, this remarkable woman who had learned to build bridges instead of walls, who had chosen healing over bitterness, who had found a partner who celebrated rather than simply tolerated our complicated family story, I realized that Dr. Caldwell had been right. My love had been worthy of celebration all along. It just hadn't looked like anyone else's love story, and that was perfectly okay. Sometimes the greatest love requires the greatest patience. Sometimes healing happens not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of small, brave choices made day after day. Sometimes the most beautiful relationships are the ones that have been broken and carefully rebuilt, stronger in the places where they were once fractured. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get the chance to discover that the love you thought wasn't enough was actually everything your child needed to grow into someone capable of creating her own beautiful love story. If you believe that it's never too late to rebuild a relationship, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, and that families are defined not by perfection but by persistence, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about the power of never giving up on the people we love. Tell me in the comments, what's the most important lesson a parent ever taught you about love? 2 more compelling stories are just a click away. If this one drew you in, wait until you see what else we found. Ready to explore?